Hello, my name is Stephen Laws. I'm a horror author, novelist. My first novel was published back in the 1980s. I'm still at it because I love horror. It's a dangerous fiction. It's a wonderful fiction. And welcome to me answering 5 questions that I don't know what they are. So let's see what we have in the pot. And taking the first one out now. And hopefully I don't need my spectacles for this. And it says, the question is Star Wars or Star Trek? Well, that's a good first question because I've just finished interviewing at the Manchester Festival of Fantastic Films Fraser Diamond, who was the son of stuntman, stunt arranger Peter Diamond, who was stuntman and stunt organizer on the Star Wars films. And indeed, Fraser himself appears as one of the characters, I think, in the first Star Wars movie. So we've been talking all things Star Wars. Star Wars or Star Trek? Well, given what I've just said to you, I have to say that my fondness lies with Star Trek, because I viewed this when it first appeared on British television. It had yet to become the massive cult that it became, but it ticked all the boxes that I wanted as a science fiction, fantasy and horror film fan back then. And even then, I could see that stories were being written for that series by, I think, Theodore Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, who was a huge influence on me, Richard Matheson and Nigel Neal. Nigel Neal didn't write for Star Trek, but I bet he would have done if he'd been asked. And some of those episodes have a very strong horror slant. There's one in particular I'm thinking about that contains a gothic haunted castle. I can't recall the title of it now, other than William Campbell, I think, was one of the guest stars. So Star Trek seems to have been with us and with me for most of my viewing life. So my preference for Star Wars or Star Trek is Star Trek. That doesn't put Star Wars down, of course. Question number 2 is, who is the best James Bond and why? Well, that's interesting. I had a conversation with my son and daughter about just recently who was the best Doctor Who and why. And the reason that jumps into my mind straight away is that I think that a person's favourite James Bond is the one that you first saw. My son's first James Bond was Daniel Craig. And he loves Daniel Craig, and James Bond will always be for him Daniel Craig. But for me, it's got to be Sean Connery. Dr. No had an edge when it came out in 1962. It's quite a violent film. And From Russia with Love, you know, Goldfinger, magnificent picture. And Sean Connery had an edge that I think he maintained throughout his Bond performances. I wasn't a fan of the Roger Moore James Bonds because they were a little bit too light-hearted for me. I like the kind of dangerous, dark danger of Bond, as I said, by Sean Connery. So he will always remain my favourite James Bond. And question number 3. I'm taking these questions out of a rather excellent Skull cup, I think it is. Who is the nicest person you've ever worked with? Oh my goodness, what a good question. Should I change it to who was the worst person you ever worked with? No, who is the nicest person? That is a very, very difficult question to answer. In terms of my writing career, there have been several. It's very difficult to pin them down. I think I had an agent called Humphrey Price who worked at Hodder and Stoughton in the English Library. He was a smashing guy, and he helped me as an editor, not just with the usual stuff, you know. Did you know your character has blue eyes on page 10 and he has green eyes on page 25? He did much more than that. We would have long discussions about horror, the genre, where it was going, and if I'd come up with an idea that I wanted to explore, he wouldn't intrude upon that, but he would ask often very insightful questions that helped me to develop a narrative of a novel I was working on. So Humphrey Price would certainly be one of those. When you say worked with, I'm wondering if that extends to things like interviews, for instance, because I mentioned I'm here at the Manchester Festival of Fantastic Films, and I've interviewed quite a few people over the years, actors and actresses, producers, composers, and I've met an awful lot of very nice people as a result of that who became really good friends. So I'd have to name drop a bit here in terms of nicest persons because they're all quite different. James Bernard was the sweetest, nicest guy I've ever worked with, well, interviewed, if you like. He composed the music for Hammer horror films, of course, and he was a very, very sweet guy. And John Carson, the actor, became a very dear friend. Very, very nice fella. He was the evil Squire Hamilton in Plague of the Zombies, and he was in Taste the Blood of Dracula. Smashing bloke. And so many of them. Yelena Faye, Veronica Carlson. But I'm guessing I'm straying from the path of the best one I've ever worked with. I've worked with the novelist Stephen Gallagher, who is a very, very dear friend. He's like a brother to me, and in fact, he's a godfather to my son. We're very close, and if I don't say he's the nicest person I've ever worked with, because we worked on projects in the past, then he'd probably kill me. So I'll forget everything I've just said to you. I'll stick with Stephen Gallagher. What is the strangest gift you've ever received? Oh my goodness me, the strangest gift. I'd have to think very hard about that. I've got lots of strange things in my study, but I wouldn't count them as gifts. Because I'm into horror, of course, I've got a lot of horror-related, fantasy-related material from movies and things, but they've been gifts that have been bought for me on request. I think... I can't think of a strange gift. I got... Andrew Keir, the actor, he played Father Shandor in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. He was also Quatermass in Hammer's movie, Quatermass in the Pit. He gifted me a wooden stake used to drive through the heart of Barbara Shelley in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Andrew signed that for me, and I've got that on a study shelf at home. So that's a good one, I think. I'll stick with the stake signed by Andrew Keir. The last one is... What were you like as a child? Well, let me say. Bookish. I was very ill as a child. I had asthma and spent most of my Christmases in bed, which is where I developed a liking for reading, for fiction. I was really quite ill. They nearly lost me 2 or 3 times. And that's where I became interested in the darkness, if you like. When you're a little kid and you're almost suffocating and you're ill quite frequently, then you develop a relationship with the terrors of the dark, and that's probably how I became a horror novelist. I became interested in the scary things as a means of coming to terms with the darkness and trying to understand why I was so frightened by these things. And of course then, horror stories developed that as a result. I became a professional horror novelist eventually, after decades and decades. So very bookish. All my pals were out in the back streets of Newcastle playing football or indulging in sport, but I was never able to do that. So my interests went elsewhere. And that's it in a nutshell, I would think. Strangely, I grew out of asthma, but I didn't grow out of horror. I'm still obsessed with horror and still forging a career after all these years. So that was me as a child. And if the child that was me could know that the man that is me had finally succeeded in becoming a horror novelist, I think the kid would have been quite happy. So that's what I was like as a child. And that's the last and 5th question, I think. And I'm guessing the check is in the post. So good luck to you all. Happy horror.